thumbs up. All right, thank you so much for that. My name is Brianna. I'm our state legislative manager here at We Act for Environmental Justice. I've been working on cumulative impacts with the amazing group of people on the call who will be speaking today for a couple of years now, and we're excited to tell you about this law, why it's such a huge win for New York, for environmental justice communities, and let's just dive in. So first of all, this presentation is permission to pollute denied. We're talking today about an historic law that will reduce the cumulative impacts of pollution on disadvantaged communities. Our agenda for today looks like we are going to be having a little bit of a welcoming. So we'll probably spend a couple more minutes waiting for a few more people to show up. Then we're going to have some opening remarks from Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins. We're going to talk about the cumulative impacts law itself. What does it mean? What does it mean to communities? How is it going to be benefiting communities of color, low-income communities across the state? For that section, it'll be myself, Arif Ullah, Executive Director of South Bronx Unite, Nikki Cross, a lawyer for the New York Lawyers for Public Interest. And then we'll go on to lessons learned from New Jersey's rulemaking process. We're going to be joined by Maggie Broughton, an attorney at the Eastern Environmental Law Center. Then we'll talk about the New York rulemaking process and how communities and yourself can get involved with Marissa Lieberman-Klein, attorney at Earth Justice. We'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A, maybe 20, maybe more or less. We'll see where we are in the presentation. And then we're going to go on to our closing. Hopefully, our intention today is to get to a lot of your questions. I'm sure some of you, many of you may not have heard of this law before, and so we're really here to do an overview, tell you about its purpose, intention, and get to a lot of your, I'm sure, well thought out questions. Let's see. Before I get into it, I wanted to give a quick thank you to, of course, the speakers that are joining me today on the call, and everyone here who is on this little thank you note. These organizations were around for the passing and championing of this piece of legislation, and I'm grateful that we are in community also working on the implementation side of this law. To figure out the rules and how it will go into effect in impacting communities. I don't think the senator has joined us yet. If that is the case, then I'm
She'll
happy to
be.
pass. Okay.
Oh no, yeah, you can start with the Assemblymember Pretlow if he's on, but she should be joining any minute.
Okay, great.
Mhm.
When she is on, Leah, if you could just let me know, that'd be wonderful. For now, I'm going to go into another slide. I'll come right back to this. So I'm going to do a little bit of an intro about what is the Cumulative Impacts Law. This bill was sponsored by Senator Andrea Stewart-Cousins and Assemblymember Pretlow. It was signed into law in December 31st in 2022. The cumulative impacts are the disproportionate exposure to environmental and public health hazards in a community from a culmination of polluting sources. So that means that when you look at low-income communities and communities of color across the state, you'll notice a pattern where there are a larger amount of polluting facilities concentrated in those communities of color. And what this law is doing is kind of stopping that pattern, changing the way that DEC is looking at siting and permits for these large polluting facilities, and really changing it from what's called a traditional risk assessment to more of a cumulative impacts assessment. Previously, the way DEC and many other permitting regulatory agencies across the state and across the United States are looking at these permits is from a traditional assessment, which is really mainly taken into account quantitative data, single sources of pollution, and not really looking at the community as a whole. And what we're shifting to now is this cumulative impact assessment, which is taking into account quantitative data, stories, storytelling, lived experiences from real people. And we're also looking at what are the other factors in the community that need to be taken into account, like housing discrimination, racism, and other factors that are going to be impacting the community's health and well-being. So that is why this law is so groundbreaking. It's a huge win for environmental justice communities. And I'll continue talking a little bit about.
I was going to say the leader is on now if you wanted to.
Wonderful. Thank you. Oh, there she is. I'm going to pin her. Welcome, Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins. So grateful to have you on the call with us. I have about like 2 to 3 minutes for you to give an opening remark. And, you know, you were a sponsor of that got this legislation passed, the Cumulative Impacts Law. And we're really grateful for your leadership on this bill. Happy to pass the floor over to you to tell us about why it's important and your passion for this topic.
Thank you so much, Brianna. And it's great to see so many people. Thanks to We Act for hosting this. And I know we have a lot of other organizations and people who care about this. I've got Earth Justice and NYPIRG, South Bronx Unite, the Eastern Environmental Law Center, and many others. If I didn't name you, you're still important to me. I thank you for doing what you do. I am excited actually because I don't usually have an opportunity as leader. I really don't sponsor many bills because I'm just so busy trying to get things to the finish line that I know are very, very important. This one was one that I've had for a while, and I really wanted to see it get over the finish line because, like so many of us, you know, we bring our experiences to the legislature or to wherever it is that we happen to be working. And I grew up, many people, I don't know, many people know, but I've told the story very often. I mean, we grew up in the housing projects in New York City. I was in Amsterdam houses right across from where Lincoln Center is now. In fact, I just went to a screening of a documentary on San Juan Hill, which was the neighborhood that was decimated in order to create Lincoln Center. It was a place where it was, you know, mostly poor people from all over. And we know that the environmental issues, certainly in terms of the things that we're talking about, were really prevalent there just because of, sadly, who was there at the time. And ultimately, Robert Moses decided to decimate everything and build a little haven there in Lincoln Center. We lived in the housing project where garbage was burned every day, where, you know, whatever was going to be cited wound up being cited where we were. I was asthmatic, I was sick, and so many of my peers were, and nobody understood why or what was happening. And then even fast forward, when I became a county legislator, the biggest issue was the sewage treatment plant. One of the reasons I got into politics at all was because of a desegregation case in the city of Yonkers that happened in the 80s and then ultimately When I got involved in government, it was because of 3 mayoral candidates who were running. Only one wanted to comply with desegregating the city in the 1990s in New York. It was unheard of, but yet it was our reality. And once I got into the position, once he won, he asked me to join the administration. And when I ultimately ran for office, one of the biggest issues was the sewage treatment plant, which had a pervasive odor, which was extremely, just difficult in terms of the quality of life. But where was it? It was in the same Southwest Yonkers community that had also been segregated against when the lawsuit was brought. And so it's clear that it's almost once something is cited somewhere, then as well, they have this. So, we might as well be able to do that. And we understand the impacts now more than ever, the health implications, the quality of life implications, and the fact that no community deserves to be the only place where things that are important to all of us get cited. And so now this cumulative impact law will allow for that assessment to be made before deciding what's already there, how is the community being impacted, and is it fair and just, environmentally right to pile on this particular community. I am excited that we have finally gotten to this point. I know there is going to be a release of what the regs will be, and also I don't know if the Assemblyman Pretlow is on yet, or if he's coming on, but I want to thank him for shepherding it through the Assembly. We know how hard it is to get both houses to pass something and then for the governor to sign it. But now it's December 30th. You all know the deadlines. You all know there's going to be rules, and you all know that you're here. And I thank you for the education and the advocacy so that we, have the input that we need so that our law works as our law. There is, the elements that we want to have in it so that, again, we will, make sure that communities that are already burdened will not be overburdened because we just decided to turn our heads. So thank you for your advocacy. Thank you all for letting me spend some time, and really thank you for championing something that is very, very important, not only to me, but I think to all of us. So thank you.
Thank you so much for those insights and storytelling, Senator. Unfortunately, some member Pretlow isn't able to join us today, but we are in constant contact with them, and they are also advocates on this issue. So thank you.
Right, and you have Leah on from my office here, as well as you know how to find me if there's anything that we can do to be helpful, not only with this, but as we go along. We, I think, have been extremely aggressive, as you know, around climate change and making sure that we are doing the right things and catching up. So we want to continue as a conference to be that partner. So please be in touch. And again, thank you all. And thank you, We Act, in particular, because I have a real connection with We Act. One of my first interns, when I first ran for senator back in 2004, wound up working for We Act. And as a lawyer, she was so inspired by the whole thing. She became a lawyer, and after doing the voting justice, she went for environmental justice. So, I'm very impressed by what you do. So thank you all.
Thank you so much. So as we heard from the Senator, we heard the overall intent for this piece of legislation. We're gonna hear from a couple other lawyers on the call about what are more of the specifics. So to kick us off, this is like the most wonky of the slides, I promise. But I'm gonna tell you a little bit about exactly what this legislation language says, so we have a sense of what we're talking about as we move through the presentation. So this exciting, groundbreaking cumulative impacts law following New Jersey's passage. So really a very nascent law does three things. It first off regulates kind of the permits that we're seeing from new and renewal facilities. There are kind of thresholds for both of these facilities in terms of like when triggering when DEC will approve a permit or not. For a new project, DEC will determine if that project will cause or contribute more than a de minimis amount of pollution to a disproportionate pollution burden on a disadvantaged community. De minimis means something so minor that it can be disregarded. So if there will be more than like the tiniest amount of pollution on a disadvantaged community for a new project, permit will really mostly not be allowed. For a renewal facility, a permit shall not be issued if it would significantly increase the existing disproportionate pollution burden in the disadvantaged community. For both of these definitions and thresholds, the entirety of what they mean in terms of the law have not yet fully been decided. That is what we are going to be looking forward to helping figure out with DEC and an upcoming rulemaking, which we'll get into in a little bit later of the presentation. This law also directs DEC to require permit applicants to prepare an existing burden report for a new project, applicable permit modification, or renewal of a permit. So most facilities across the state will need to provide an existing burden report. And what goes into this report, we'll get into when it's Nikki's time to speak. And then it will also direct DEC to require actions for a facility to implement any appropriate operational changes that reduce pollution burden. So this law would make sure that we're not adding to the pollution burden of communities, but that we're ratcheting down the pollution burden in those communities by making sure that DEC has the ability to implement any changes that would make it so. So I'm going to move us on to why this law is really important to communities like Harlem and like the Bronx. The reason why We Act has been involved in the passing and leading the implementation efforts for this bill is because we have exactly that. We're a case study for a community that is facing disproportionate pollution burden. I think We Act's founding is very famous in that our founding was fighting the North River sewage treatment plant on 145th Street. That was causing a lot of noxious emissions, that there were foul odors. It was causing health effects in our community. We also have the Kingsbridge bus depot located in Inwood. We have a 207th Street train yard. We have a 110th Street Con Ed substation, Department of Sanitation truck parking lots. And these are just to name a few of the facilities that are located in Northern Manhattan. But Northern Manhattan is a community that is high on the extreme heat vulnerability index, has some of the highest asthma rates in the city. And we want to make sure with this law that we are doing everything we can to mitigate the impacts of those. So I will move us on to Arif, over to you.
Thank you, Brianna, and thank you to the Senate leader for championing this. And thanks to everyone here who is interested in this and for listening in. Brianna has mentioned how important this legislation is for communities like the South Bronx, like Northern Manhattan, and across the state, really, communities that have experienced disproportionate pollution burden for decades. And this pollution burden essentially turns us into a sacrifice zone. And yes, many of these facilities may be producing a greater public good, but why is it that communities like the South Bronx, like Northern Manhattan, are always asked to shoulder the burden for that greater public good? So we understand and we look at this new piece of legislation as a tool for us to fight back, for us to prevent the siting of any new polluting facilities, and as Brianna mentioned, also to really curtail the types of activities that existing polluting facilities in our community are basically burdening us with pollution. So right here, this is an image of our waterfront. So whereas other parts of New York City have seen a waterfront renaissance with promenades and green spaces, et cetera, this is what our waterfront looks like. This is just on the lower left side is just one of 2 peak power plant sites. A stone's throw away is another peak power plant site. And these peakers are running on a regular basis now. They're not just running on peak energy demand days. This site you see sits on Con Ed campus. Right across from it is a Action carting facility, which is a private waste carting facility. Next to it is a printing press. And then beyond that, the green space you see actually is Randall's Island, taunting and teasing us. And we want to be able to create green spaces as well. We love Randall's Island. We're glad that it's there. There's a great connector that connects people from the South Bronx to the connector, to the Randall's Island rather. But we want those types of green spaces as well. Brianna, would you move to the next slide? This is the other peaker plant site. So the one we just saw is known as Hellgate. This is known as Harlem River Yard. And these are also running on a regular basis. The FedEx trucks you see are a last mile operation. And many of you already know about last mile operations. So environmental injustice upon environmental injustice, pollution burden upon pollution burden. Let's keep it going. Home heating oil facility also on our waterfront. And you can see the power plants we looked at just a little while ago off to the upper left side. And then beyond that, in the center up is the other power plant site. So, again, just a view of the heavy concentration of polluting facilities that we have in the Mott Haven Port Morris section of the South Bronx. And this is entirely a result of discriminatory public policies, racist public policies, redlining, urban renewal programs, zoning regulations that saw it fit to cite one polluting facility after another in a community like the South Bronx. Unfortunately, and too often, these sites are located in Black, brown, immigrant, and low-income communities. So very, very tied with class and race. Let's go to the next slide. And this is another last mile warehouse you see with Fresh Direct. 1,000 daily truck trips through the streets of Mott Haven, Port Morris, and beyond every day. And then in front of that, you see the garbage train, and that train carries out waste that has been processed at a nearby waste management facility, and that facility processes the household waste of the entire Bronx, as well as other types of waste. So it takes it out to Albany and then brings it down to Virginia. I think that's my last slide. And, the main point that I want to really make here and emphasize is how this piece of legislation really now gives us a tool to combat this landscape that I just described to you. The one other thing I'll just point out is look at the heavy concentration of, the dense population right behind these facilities. You have several towers, all of which are NYCHA public housing developments. So all of these facilities are located within a stone's throw from a very, very densely populated community, and that simply isn't acceptable. And this legislation will help us to improve the situation in the South Bronx, and hopefully other communities can use it as a tool too. Back to you, Brianna.
Thanks so much, Arif. I will now pass it over to Nikki Cross.
Thanks, Brianna and Arif. I'm Nikki Cross. I'm an attorney with New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. And I'll just be giving a very broad overview of the law. Of course, the devil is really in the details. So I'm going to drop my email and Marissa's email in the chat. And if you have more detailed questions that we can't get into in the Q&A, please please let us know. Arif just gave a really great demonstration of the types of facilities that would be covered. But it's a really broad array of activities and facilities or sources. Really anything that may cause or contribute to more than a de minimis amount, more than a trivial amount, as Brianna said, of pollution to a disadvantaged community. So all of the examples that were given above, sewage treatment plants like in Southwest Yonkers that Senator Stewart Cousins mentioned, liquefied natural gas terminals, any projects seeking permits for water and air pollution, and solid and hazardous waste management, and anything withdrawing over 20 million gallons a day for cooling purposes. And at the bottom, we have the Brookhaven landfill and the Con Ed liquid natural gas plant in Astoria, which would certainly be covered. And the question of what does the law require of these facilities? Basically, any new or renewal or modified permit application that might meet that de minimis threshold for pollution in a disadvantaged community has to prepare an existing burden report. And in that report, these applicants need to identify and estimate the amounts of pollution likely to affect the community. They need to identify the environmental and public health stressors already borne by the disadvantaged community. And they need to design measures to minimize those burdens. And they also need to identify existing or possible benefits to the community. And that excludes jobs as a potential benefit. The law also requires these applicants to conduct public outreach, provide information that's easily understandable, and to solicit and incorporate community input in their decision making. Next slide. So what's DEC's role? They're the agency that's going to be issuing these permits, and they must comply with this law when doing so. So they cannot issue permits for new projects with more than a de minimis amount of pollution to a DAC, and can't issue renewals or modifications with a significant amount of pollution to a DAC. DEC must also, in that process, identify whether the project is likely to affect a disadvantaged community. DEC must also include these communities in their decision making and ensure transparency throughout the process. And we're also asking for DEC's Office of Environmental Justice to be more involved in the process and assess the adequacy of these burden reports. Next slide. So there are a couple of questions remaining in the rulemaking process, and Marissa's going to go into more detail. But the remaining questions include DEC needing to clarify the standards and processes for when burden reports are required, what types of emissions mitigation measures are adequate, how these measures will be enforced, and how the permits will be enforced, and adequate levels of transparency, outreach, and meaningful public involvement. Thanks, Brianna.
Thanks so much, Nikki. So I'm gonna now pass it over to the wonderful Maggie Broughton, who is here with us from Jersey, and is going to tell us about, I mentioned that this law was the second of its kind in the nation to pass. That is following Jersey leadership And we're going to hear from Maggie, who works on, well, I'll just pass it over to you, Maggie. Introduce yourself. You're going to do a better job than me. Go ahead.
Thanks, Brianna. I appreciate it. And thank you so much for having me here today. It's really great to hear from all the advocates and attorneys in New York City working on the cumulative impacts law. Thank you for your work and super happy to have this cross-state collaboration. As Brianna was saying, my name is Maggie Broughton. I'm the environmental justice staff attorney at the Eastern Environmental Law Center, which is based in Newark, New Jersey. And let's get right into it. I've got a series of questions here on the screen, and I just want to run through the answers to all of them so we can kind of do a little comparison of what the New Jersey law is, what it's done, and what you folks in New York can learn from the implementation and creation of this law in New Jersey. So the types of facilities that are covered, there's basically 3 criteria. It has to be one of 8 facility types. So that includes major sources of air pollution, incinerators, sludge processing facilities, landfills, recycling and solid waste facilities, and a few others. So it has to be one of those 8 types. Compared to the New York law, the New York one, in my reading, is a little more expansive, right? It's not just limited to 8 different types of facilities. So that could be a benefit to communities because more facilities are captured, or it might come up against some more pushback from industries for that reason. So maybe a double-edged sword there, but a little difference in the New Jersey and New York law. So that's the first criteria for coverage under the law. The second one is that the facility must be proposed to be located or currently located in an overburdened community. So similar to a disadvantaged community under the New York law. But the definitions are a bit different. The definition for an overburdened community in New Jersey is that it has to be either at least 35% of residents are categorized as low income, 40% categorized as minority residents, to use the language of the law, or 40% limited English proficiency households. So it can meet one or more of those criteria, and that's on a block group level, so very hyper localized. So if there's a facility located or proposed to be located in an overburdened community, then it checks that second box. The third one is that it has the type of permit that the applicant is applying for needs to be one of 12 listed in the New Jersey law. So that includes the Solid Waste Management Act, Air Pollution Control Act, Water Pollution Control Act, and many more. So those are our 3 categories, those 3 check boxes in order for a facility to be covered. It has to be one of the 8 facility types, has to be located entirely or partially in an overburdened community, and has to have all 3, and has to be applying for an environmental permit under one of the 12 laws listed. So those are the types of facilities covered. Now, what does the law require? Similar to the New York law, there needs to be an environmental justice impact statement. So some type of review of the current and potential environmental and public health stressors associated with the facility, whether or not those stressors can be avoided, mitigation measures, control measures to address the types of pollutions emitted from facilities and the potential impacts on the overburdened community that it's to be cited in or already cited in. But in the New Jersey environmental justice impact statement requirements, there's no required description of benefits that exist in the community, which I think is a bit of a gap, because we also want to know like what's going well, whether there can be more benefits that potentially these facilities can to the communities. That's an important consideration, but the New Jersey law primarily focuses on those burdens and has a very similar purpose to the New York law in preventing further oversighting of polluting facilities in New Jersey's overburdened communities. Another thing that the New Jersey law requires is a very strict public participation process. It's labeled as a meaningful public participation process. And that was also required by what we called the Administrative Order 2021-25. So the law was passed in September of 2020. The regulations were not adopted until last year in April, so April 2023. So this administrative order required heightened public participation requirements in the spirit of the environmental justice law, while our Department of Environmental Protection was creating the regulations to implement this law. So the New Jersey law requires public notice to be published. It's also required to be published on the Department of Environmental Protection's website. There has to be a public hearing held in the overburdened community that is affected. The notice has to be published in at least 2 newspapers. One of them has to be a non-English newspaper, depending on the languages spoken in that community. The applicant must receive oral and written comments in the public comment process and must submit a transcript of that public hearing to the Department of Environmental Protection, among other requirements. So it's kind of a more strict public participation process than required by other laws, for example, the Administrative Procedure Act. But what I've noticed about the New York law is that it's somewhat silent on these types of public participation, and it is something that they're looking at in the rulemaking, as was mentioned by our New York advocates. And so, next question, what are the Department of Environmental Protection's powers under the law? Similar to the New York law, we have this distinction between new facilities and existing facilities. So for the existing facilities, we cover air permit renewals and expansions of currently existing facilities. However, the New York law requires your DEC to deny permits for both types of facilities if they have a certain level of impacts. In New Jersey, unfortunately, the DEP only has the power to deny permits for new facilities that have disproportionate impacts on the overburdened community that cannot be avoided, unless, of course, there's an exception, unless it serves a compelling public interest to that overburdened community, which could be an essential public health and safety need. If you have questions about that, please ask me in the Q&A. That gets into the weeds a little bit, but is still an important provision. So DEP has to deny a permit for new facilities that have disproportionate impacts, but it cannot deny either an air permit renewal or a permit for an existing facility expansion. It has to, however, impose conditions on those permits to mitigate those disproportionate impacts. So a little bit different there. No denials for existing facilities in New Jersey, but that was part of the originally proposed law, but was changed due to industry pressure in the rulemaking, in the lawmaking process. So good on New York for having a bit of a stricter standard there. That's going to be really important. So now I want to turn to the legal challenges that the New Jersey regulations have faced. Shortly after the regulations were adopted in April of 2023, we got 2 challenges in the court system from industry groups in June of 2023. So really quick turnaround there. We got challenges from the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries, as well as the Engineers Labor Employer of the International Union of Operating Engineers Local 825. So that's going to be ISRI and ELAC 825, so I don't have to keep saying that. So what parts of the law are they challenging? Those 2 appellants largely argue that the Department of Environmental Protection's regulations are not reasonable interpretations of the law. So when DEP did its rulemaking process, it interprets the law to add more details, to add those standards and processes, which is the current process that New York is going through right now with their cumulative impacts law. We're already done with that in New Jersey, and industry doesn't like it. So their main arguments hinge on that, saying that the DEP, their regulations are inconsistent with the law and should be overturned, but only in a few areas. So The regulations cover what are called zero population block groups. Those are non-residential block groups. And when a facility is directly adjacent to an overburdened community block group, then that facility is treated as if it's in an overburdened community. This was not, thanks. This was not specifically addressed in the law itself, but DEP kind of extrapolated the legislature's intent to, you know, protect overburdened communities, to prevent oversighting of facilities in overburdened communities and address the impacts from those facilities. So it captured more facilities under that zero population block group designation. The appellants didn't like that and opposed that definition, that regulation of those facilities. So that's just one example. They opposed a lot of other things. So if you want more information, we can chat about that another time, since I've got a little warning and I want to get to what are the results that we've seen from the implementation and enforcement of the environmental justice law in New Jersey. So unfortunately, only 6 facilities have been captured by the environmental justice law, compared to 88 facilities that have been covered under the administrative order. So there's a lot more requirements under the environmental justice law. And so one example is that there's only one of them that's a new facility as well. So the other 5 are existing facilities seeking things like renewals of their Title V air permits. But one is a new facility in Jersey City, where I live. And it is a proposed solid waste facility, a transfer station and materials recovery facility, seeking a solid waste facility permit and an air permit. Where they are in the process, there's none of those 6 facilities have completed the environmental justice process. There's been some hiccups, there's been some snags that they've hit along the way. This particular facility submitted an environmental justice impact statement, which DEP determined was deficient. So they're kind of stuck there. They can't move forward with public participation. DEP can't make a decision on their permit under the EJ law until they have that done. So they may just not submit a new one at all, and then their project would kind of be done at that point unless they resubmit. And so some of the practical impacts that we've seen, it's kind of hard to tell at this point. Maybe the practical impact is that we have like one new facility, maybe they're not going to resubmit their application because it's too much of a burden to place it in an overburdened community. So it's a bit hard to tell, but what I can tell is that there has been a lot more public awareness due to the administrative order process that's been ongoing for a few years. And DEP is publishing a lot of information on its website, the public notices, the impact statements, responses to comments, transcripts, hearing recordings. So there's a lot more availability and transparency of information around these facilities, but we haven't really gotten to the point of seeing whether or not it's preventing or addressing the oversighting of these facilities. We haven't seen whether it's like reducing air pollution, whether it's reducing water pollution, noise impacts, et cetera, yet. So that remains to be seen. And I think that's all I've got. So thank you so much again for having me. Happy to answer any questions, and I will drop my email in the chat. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Maggie. Our last teeny presenter for today is Marissa Lieberman-Klein, an attorney with Earth Justice, and I will pass it over to you, Marissa.
Great. Thanks, Brianna. My name is Marissa Lieberman-Klein. I'm an associate attorney in Earth Justice's Northeast Regional Office based here in New York City. I'm just going to talk a little bit about where DEC is in this process, where the process goes from here, and then how you can get involved. So this past summer, DEC held stakeholder sessions with community groups and other people who worked on this law to try and figure out what was important to these groups and to communities going into them drafting the regulations. DEC is in that process of drafting regulations, And they estimate that they will have proposed regulations in December. Sorry, excuse me for 1 second. So when those regulations are published, the comment period will begin. The cumulative impact law becomes effective at the end of this year. And so there will be a period where the law is effective, but we don't have regulations. Because the comment period will likely last into 2025. And the final regulations will be published at that point. Next slide. So there will be an official comment period, but comments can be submitted to DC now. You don't have to wait for that comment period to begin. The official comment period will be on the specific proposed regulations rather than general thoughts. So in terms of what you can submit now without proposed regulations, again, you can submit anything. There's no requirement that it be on a specific issue, but DEC has said they're looking specifically for things like quantitative standards, stuff about community engagement, public participation, and definitions of key terms like de minimis and significant increase. So for that, some of their questions about data are, for example, how will underlying data used to identify DACs be incorporated into the regulatory framework? How will some of these stressor contributions be determined? And how will that information be accessible to community members? And how will DEC determine how this is used? There's also a lot that DEC is thinking in terms of how to engage with communities as they develop these regs, and in terms of how all these terms will be defined. There's also questions, as we said, about public participation for the applicants during the burden report and permitting process. The law itself does not specify anything about public participation, but we've also heard that DEC is looking to update their EJ public participation policy, which is called Commissioner's Policy 29. So if you have thoughts about how that policy could be made better, that may be something to bring to DEC before the regs come out, and they can determine what's best in that policy versus what's best to go in the regs, because they don't want to put anything in the regulations that is outside the scope of the law. The other things they're looking at is what will be required of the burden report. The law lays out a few things that have to be required, but how are those things defined? What does the applicant need to put in there? And then how will DEC review the burden report? How will they receive it? Will it be public as they receive it, or only after they've looked at it? And then again, how will they define de minimis, significant increase? What is a disproportionate pollution burden? All of those things are what DEC is looking at. And again, what is an essential need? As we said, facilities that are essential needs of disadvantaged communities get permits even if they cause a significant increase. So, or a de minimis pollution burden if it's a new facility. So how is that essential need defined? How will DEC determine that it's an essential need of the community rather than of the state at large? And then how will DEC deal with things like mitigation and offsets, and what will be reasonable? So those are all questions they're looking to answer before the rules come out. So those are things you can put in comments now. And then of course the official comment period later will be on the specifics of their proposed regulations. And again, you can send comments at any time, send them to the EJ office. And then for the actual official comment period, there will be a notice in the environmental notice bulletin that comes out every Wednesday and it will have the link to the proposed regulation and where to send your comments. And I'll pass it back to Brianna for Q&A. Brianna, you're muted.
Of course. So we went a little bit over time. We can take a couple of questions, but if we don't get to answer your question today, A lot of emails were dropped in the chat. I'm also going to drop my email in the chat. So feel free to contact any of us on this call with your question, and we'd be more than happy to help answer it. The first question I believe that we received was from Courtney Williams. The question is, in a discussion with DEC Deputy Commissioner of EJ, she had no idea how many Title V permits were expired. How is there a hope of these laws having an impact if DEC can indefinitely extend permits, and the two Title V emitters in peak scale have permits that expired in 2019 and 2021? So I don't know if anyone would want to take that.
Sure, I can take it. So this is a real problem. This is something called an administrative continuance that DEC does basically to continue having facilities operate until they can review their actual permit renewal. And it's something we were thinking about when we submitted comments with some other groups to DEC. I can send around that letter if people are particularly interested. Just email me and let me know if you want to see it. And basically what we said was that DEC needs to find a way to have the burden report submitted at the beginning of the administrative continuance process. If there's, for example, a short form that DEC is sending an applicant being like, do you want your permit renewed? Yes, no. Even if it's that kind of simple short form, which they're not really supposed to do, but sometimes they do, that needs to include that needs to also say to the applicant, if you want your permit renewed, submit the burden report. And, DEC needs to review that burden report in a timely fashion. They can't just, sit on it again for years and years and say, well, we've administratively continued it. I don't know that there's like a surefire way to ensure that DEC does that without, trying to get some timelines in the regulations that I don't think DEC would realistically agree to put in the regulations. But it is a principle that we put in a letter to DEC that we submitted to them last month, and is something that we've been thinking about, and I know other advocates have been thinking about.
Thanks for that, Marissa. I see another question from Giuseppe. Is there information on how what constitutes de minimis pollution will be determined? What is the threshold? Should we expect DEC regulations on this question? Is that also for you, Marissa?
I can take it unless Nikki, you want it?
Go ahead, I think that's a good process question.
Yeah. So de minimis is a term that DEC is going to need to define. They will probably do some sort of threshold. They may want to make it quantitative. I think the idea being that the clearer it is what that means, the harder it is for applicants to try and, write a burden report that says no or less than de minimis. If it's more of a descriptive term, then there's a little more wiggle room for applicants. And I think it's reasonable to expect that most applicants are going to want to, get their permits and will not be trying to write the most comprehensive burden report in the world unless they're required to by law. So I do think DEC is going to set that threshold. They will probably set it a quantitative amount. In terms of information on what that is, there's nothing out there currently. You can kind of go to other laws and look to see how they define de minimis. I believe the city in their seeker regulation has some things. There's some stuff in the Clean Air Act that may be, helpful, but there's nothing binding DEC to a specific amount at this time. Again, if that's something that you have thoughts on, or someone you work with has thoughts on, especially like in terms of setting a quantitative amount, that would be great to submit to DEC as soon as possible.
I see another question from Isabella. Do we predict public awareness about this issue to increase in New York? I'll take that. So we want to make sure here at WEAC that folks are aware of this law and that it's coming and it's exciting, which is a big part of why we're doing the webinar today. to tell you about it and what its impact will be. But at WEAC, we also are hoping to, in January, start a series of town halls focused on community input and engagement. So that is to be determined, to be coming. You all, since you're here, will likely receive information about that. So thank you all for being here. And I'll also pass it over to you, Maggie, to talk about what has the public engagement process been like in New Jersey, and kind of what are some things we can maybe learn from that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think something that could be really helpful for New York to engage in is that our DEP did a series of stakeholder meetings, especially on like the more like contentious parts of the law that they were interpreting. So I think they did like there's a requirement for a geographic point of comparison. So you have to compare the stressors in the block group to and they were trying to figure out like what that comparison demographic was going to be. So it was either going to be like county level, state level, does it include non-overburdened communities? Does it include overburdened communities? So they landed on having it be the lower number of either the state or the county level stressor designation, which like this gets into a lot of little technical definitions as well. But basically they used a public participation process where they talked to environmental justice advocates, they talked to industry groups, they talked to the public about what do you think? They put like presentations together and gathered information and feedback. And they landed on the geographic point of comparison they did because it was the most expansive and most protective of overburdened communities. So I think doing that kind of stakeholder process, DEP has used that to fall back on in defending its regulations as well. So as much like public process as they can get in, that's going to be really important. I think having something like the administrative order that we had in New Jersey that heightened public participation process in that interim period that Marissa mentioned. Oh, I think I froze there for a sec. But great, I didn't. Cool, you did. But during that interim process, which for us was a couple of years, so that gave applicants and the DEP some practice into what that public participation would look like and increased awareness in between that period of the law being effective and the regulations being adopted. So it kind of helped fill that gap, helped industries kind of know what to expect from that part of the law and brought more public awareness to it. But it's been implemented kind of here and there. Sometimes DEP posts the notices to the website. Sometimes they post the hearing recording. Sometimes there's a written response to comments. So it hasn't always been consistent across industries. So that's a little bit about what it's looked like in New Jersey so far.
Thanks so much, Maggie. The last thing I'll talk about today is for further learning and further information. WEACT actually has a podcast episode about cumulative impacts that came out just this week. It is featuring Dr. Nikki Sheets, who can be described as like the grandfather of cumulative impacts. And so if you'd like to learn more about New Jersey's process, New Jersey's history, cumulative impacts as a theory as a whole, please tune into that episode for further learning and resources. And I believe that concludes today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our amazing presenters today as well.